Welcome to another ICS Village production. The ICS Village is a non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of industrial control system security. Visit our website at icsvillage.com to discover more about us, where to find the village, participate in our community engagement project, and how to sponsor and donate to the ICS Village efforts.
I think we're good. Can you guys hear me in the back okay? Yes? Good. Excellent. Okay, it's just about time. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming and thanks for the invite to this session. I want to talk about some research that is ongoing that we've been doing for a number of years in applying behavioral analysis to ICS networks and environments in order to be able to detect and combat problems within those environments. This presentation is done by myself and Mike Raggo. Mike unfortunately got COVID and he can't be here today. We typically do these presentations together, but Mike sends his best if some of the folks in the audience don't know. So we'll go ahead and get started, and I want to kind of walk through this so you guys can understand where our research is and what we've been doing. So again, just from a contact point of view, Mike is an author, speaker, and researcher. He's the CEO and co-founder of Silent Signals. My name is Chet Hosmer, and I'm the assistant professor of practice at the University of Arizona, and also serve as the co-founder and chief scientist at Silent Signals with Mike. Mike and I have published a whole set of books on a variety of topics. I think Gary Kessler's in the room, who's I think been the tech editor on all my books, or at least most of them. And so Gary's been a great friend in this whole arena. Everybody still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Why don't I just take it out of the script?
Either way.
Let's do that. Is that better in the back?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. So anyway, again, hats off to Gary Kessler for serving as the tech editor and writing his own books and whatever. It's been great to work with Gary over the years, and certainly in this area is relevant to several of the books that I've written as well as with Mike. So we look at this whole issue of cybersecurity as it relates to industrial control systems and, let's say, critical infrastructures in general. And we start by looking at it from what we call the CIA triad. CIA triad is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But we think we are the only ones that actually try to apply this model more directly to industrial control environments. It's been out there. So how does that actually, what are some of the things that we need to consider and how are we applying that within this environment? Well, let's start with confidentiality. Within ICS environments, we have everything you would imagine, right? We have data that's at rest, we have data that's in motion, we have data that's in use, we have local devices, local servers, cloud, etc. On the integrity side of the triad, we're concerned with things like cryptography, cryptographic hashing, and digital signatures, and multi-factor authentication. These things don't exist in ICS environments today. M-event access control within those environments. If you're not familiar with M-event access control, it means that if I'm going to make a critical change to a system, I have to have more than one person agree with that change, right? So the M is how many we need to basically approve whatever change we're going to make to the infrastructure, N is the number of people that could provide that service. And then one of the new things that we're looking at is zero trust, which is a new standard that came out of NSA that basically is looking at ways that we're going to secure our environments and our endpoints in a way that we basically trust no one. And we have to basically perform that operation. The last is availability, and obviously within ICS environments, this is really critical, right? These systems have to work over a long period of time. So there's things like, how do we assess this? Continuous health, how do we perform audits and checks? How do we provide redundancy from an alternate operating capability? So if a system goes down, how do we switch over, and how do we do that immediately? How do we perform 3-to-1 backups so that we can basically recover from ransomware attacks that might occur within an ICS environment? Right? And then, obviously, how do we even perform security updates in this environment? Obviously, there are a plethora of protocols that are at play here. We heard earlier about Modbus, which I'll talk about as well, but there's BACnet and many other protocols that are involved when you're operating an industrial control environment. So how do we actually deal with all of these different protocols that we actually have to experiment with as well? So one of the areas that we've been working in for quite some time is the concept of active cyber defense, or ACD. And this particular area has several different components, and it was originally developed by DARPA and the U.S. Air Force Research Lab, and it's now being adapted to be used within critical infrastructure environments like ICS. The core concept is different than the way we thought about security in the past. The core concept is we anticipate that we're going to be attacked and breached, versus we're going to defend everything all of the time. So the question then becomes, well, now we have to be able to prepare for that breach. How are we going to respond to it, and how are we going to react? And so we're going to talk today and focus on a couple elements of this in detail, but there are 4 basic elements that we have to deal with. First is asset identification. If we don't know what devices are operating within our environment, and more importantly, how are they behaving within the environment? It's not just knowing we have a device that's supposed to do this. We want to understand how it behaves over a period of time. Okay? So from that perspective, we want to be able to model that normal behavior without under attack in order to be able to perform that. And then we also want to be able to detect that aberrant behavior that may be occurring within that environment from that point of view. NIST basically details this in great terms, talking about the testing and validating and understanding underlying vulnerabilities and weaknesses and defects within that environment that come from that baselining of the assets that we have. And obviously, what do those assets do? What are their importance to the mission? The second area that I'm not going to talk about a lot, but we also then have to be able to, once we understand our environment and our network and the operation and the devices and the endpoints and what they're doing under normal conditions, well, what happens if they're attacked? What do we do then? We can't even do the second stage very well unless we have done the first stage really well in understanding. So then we can prepare, we can detect, we can contain, we can eradicate, we can recover, and we can perform post-response. If you've been involved in this before, you understand that there are so many people in an organization, in many organizations, that are involved in incident response. It's just not a technical problem. It's also a public relations problem with the CEO and internal counsel. All of those folks are involved in incident response and what we do. The next area is another area I'm going to talk in more detail about today, which is basically threat identification and manipulation. In my opinion, it's one of the sexiest areas of active cyber defense because we get to go on the offense. We're not actually hacking back in this particular case, but we're actually right up to the point where we would do that. Okay, I'll talk about how we're actually dealing with that. And then the last stage is threat intelligence. How do we actually take intelligence about threats that we know are coming, and what do we do about them? So here's the question. If we don't understand our network and the behavior, and we have a threat, how can we determine what to do? Or if that threat even involves our environment? Right, so the first stage, again, is better understanding our environment and how it operates under all conditions. So I'm going to talk about 2 areas today in a little bit more detail and show you some of the progress that we've made in this particular area to kind of show you. We're going to talk about dynamic passive asset mapping and behavior analysis, and I'm going to talk about the threat manipulation aspect. I'm going to cover both of those, so one follows the other. Everybody with me so far? Cool. So let's talk about what dynamic passive asset mapping is. Traditionally, when we think about mapping the assets within an environment, we tend to probe the network, right? We do vulnerability assessments, we do pen tests, we do network mapping, and whatever. Well, typically in ICS environments, we can't do that, right? Because of the danger of us taking a production network, and by doing the probing, we take that system down, right? And we have problems with it. So we have to do this passively. But by doing this passively, it gains us some other advantages as well, and we'll talk about those. So what is this dynamic passive asset mapping capability? We want to detail the normal behavior, not just what systems do and how they respond, but how do we actually monitor and create this map of their normal behavior over a period of time. So the monitoring must occur without probing network. Rather, we use sophisticated sniffers in order to capture and categorize network behaviors. Well, that poses another problem. If you've ever done this, right, you end up, even over a short period of time, I have millions and millions of packets that I have to basically deal with. So if you run Wireshark, that's what it'll give you, right? Sorry, I guess I'm supposed to start. Anyway, so we have to be able to figure out how we can actually condense that map into something we can actually use. And that's one of the areas we believe we have solved things. So what can we map in this environment? Well, we certainly can map network connections and timing, unusual foreign or unauthorized connections and protocols that are operating, observed behavior of the endpoints within our environment. We can also consider things like aberrant observation under specific protocols that operate under the IP level. In other words, things like Modbus. And then also we can categorize protocol usage and categorizations. We can correlate between IT and OT elements. That's really a critical factor that we're going to talk about in a minute. And correlation of the relevant environmental factors that are involved. So when I'm talking about the environmental factors, let's say we have a power plant and we're actually monitoring the behavior. So we're monitoring the behavior, we're looking at all the packets, and we're monitoring the categorization over some period of time, let's say a month. And we know everything is normal. It doesn't do us much good. A lot of people have tried to do this, and it doesn't work very well. And it doesn't work very well because you're not considering the environment that's operating in it. We're going to talk about how we actually include that now. So one of the questions is, how can we use ML and AI to help? So from a supervised learning perspective, we want to be able to define known good behaviors, right? And those are the known allowed protocols, devices, services, along with their behaviors over some period of time. The anticipated activity, for example, the time of day, day of week, and bandwidth usage under certain conditions. The correlation with these environmental factors, these would be sensors, workflow, weather, human factors that are involved that are not purely in the protocols that we're going to monitor. And then known timing. In other words, when are upgrades going to happen? When are there planned outages or maintenance? And those things are going to affect not only the baselining of the environment, but also how we're going to react in a real environment. We can also define some bad behaviors, right? Known malicious actors, locations, countries, observed bad human behaviors, known threat behaviors from malware, and then certainly reconnaissance activity we can monitor pretty well. We understand when our systems are being reconned unless the suspect is really, really sophisticated. So what we have developed is software that will actually perform this mapping from a passive perspective. In this particular example I'm showing you, we can basically take a monitored environment, and this could come from several points within the environment that we're doing. So we use small lightweight devices like Raspberry Pis or NUCs that we basically implant in the environment in order to capture the network traffic and the environmental factors that we're interested in. And then we can actually use the software in order to be able to analyze those to create what we would consider to be a baseline of environments. So in this case, you probably can't see it, but in this particular capture, there was, just to kind of do something simple, there were 21,000 packets involved in this simple capture that we did. It's obviously not very big, but we've done millions of those. But when we actually, see the problem of not being able to do this live, the animations don't work. Anyway, let me see if I can move some of this out of the way. So one of the things that, even though we had that number of packets, we have reduced that to a smaller number in order to be able to...
You want to fix that part?
Yeah.
Go ahead, keep going.
Okay. So the concept is that we can reduce the number of items that we want to be able to look at. No, thanks. Yeah, they said they do it the other way because it was falling off the screen. Oh, I moved that bottom piece. That's okay.
Sorry, I'm going to get this fixed.
It looks pretty good.
There you go. There you go, sir.
Okay, thanks. So by by reducing that, the amount, by basically taking and reducing it. So we've come up with a way to basically identify what makes up a unique connection within the environment. And so we significantly reduce this down from 21,000 packets that we have to analyze to about 20. And we can then, not only can we actually provide that reduction, but now we can calculate other information about those unique packets. When did they occur? What time of day? What day of week did they happen? How often did they occur? So we can see all of those things that are there. So basically, we can also then look at things like the services that we've observed on each of the endpoint and what services are running over that period of time. And again, on what day of week, what time of day, all of that information. So now we actually have a model of what is, quote, normal for that environment in a reduced fashion. Okay, so we've taken, in many cases, millions of packets and reduced them to maybe 1,000 unique connections that we have to actually deal with. And now we can model those. So then we can actually take a look at one of those specific servers or devices that we have and actually analyze that behavior. And obviously we can then observe the connections and diagrams and visualize this so we can look at this in a reasonable way in order to be able to provide this information. So this is basically a quick demo. I'm not going to play this for you. I want to get to a couple of different points here because I want to show you what we do in actually extracting data from the Modbus environment. So in this particular case, for this same session that we have, we know exactly what Modbus protocols were used and what connections were made between systems, and how many there were, and how many failed and how many were successful. So now we can actually take a look at this protocol in a little bit more detail. And then we can also take a look at every single, Dave mentioned this earlier, we can look at every single request and response and determine if it was good or not. So in other words, this one we classified as normal. We got a request and we got the response that we were expecting. But we also have some that will fail. Jumping through this. So this particular one failed. So because we're able to monitor the requests and responses within this environment, we can say, wait a minute, we have a Modbus packet sequence because we've analyzed the request and the response that are associated with it. We can say, hey, somebody actually tried to probe a diagnostic device that was out there. Somebody mentioned it earlier about basically using Metasploit to basically do this. So in this particular case, we caught it. And basically what happened was there was a diagnostic request, but the device denied it. Right? So that would be very unusual that we want to be able to investigate that further. So we can take this deeper look. We also have ones where, in this particular demo, we have a warning where we had a request that went out to a device to get information, but we never got the response. So what happened there? So now we can actually take this deeper dive into this protocol and actually understand what's happening with, more importantly, we found in this particular case, by the way, this was a session that was done at DEFCON a couple of years ago that we got this packet capture from. So in this particular case, we have something really unusual. We have a response with no associated request, which implies that the device was compromised and was sending out response data without being requested. So now we're able to actually identify those anomalies that we're seeing in the protocol as they're actually happening, and we can analyze those. Okay? Let's go to this. So what do we do with all this information, and how do we actually use it in order to be able to take the next step? Once we've actually created this detailed baseline of the normal behavior, what do we do with that? Well, we want to leverage this detailed asset map that we have, this baseline, in order to, along with other environmental factors that we've measured at the same point in time, okay, in order to be able to create a data set that we could use for machine learning. So once we've done that, we can take the next step. We can take that data set that we've created, which obviously includes all of those environmental characteristics that are associated with them as well. And we can perform feature extraction. So we can take a look at that data over that period of time and extract features that we believe are meaningful. Now, one of the things about machine learning is you're supposed to basically perform machine learning without programming the computer, but letting machine learning algorithms actually do this. I teach this at Arizona. But basically, in this particular case, we have to make some choices about what features we think are going to be important that are going to actually provide us with some information. Then what we do is we scrub that data, and we generate descriptive statistics that are associated with the data that we saw within the baseline that we created. Everybody with me so far? So then once we've done that, we can actually create a machine learning engine and actually have an engine that we can run. The problem is, this process is very iterative. In other words, in order to get this right, we have to continue to tune the feature extraction, we have to scrub the data, we have to generate statistics, we have to choose the right algorithms, and so on and so forth. But once we're done, and we have a model that represents normal behavior of that environment, now we can use that machine learning engine in order to do the next step. We can deploy that machine learning engine on a lightweight sensor, like a Raspberry Pi or a NUC, and basically perform the exact same feature extraction that we did when we built the baseline model, okay, along with the environmental factors that are happening right now during the time that we captured it. And we can apply that to the model, and then we can generate alerts. So it gives us a way to basically allow the machine learning engine to be able to identify these anomalies within the environment that we're looking at by using what we baselined with the tools that we've created in order to do this. Okay? So that's step one in our approach from a research perspective of what we've been doing basically over the last several years in order to be able to perfect this. In fact, we wrote a couple of books on this, of how to basically do this passive monitoring and create these baselines that will actually perform this. So what's the next step? I mentioned at the beginning that I was going to talk about two elements that we're going to be using. This first one allows us to create a baseline of the model, which can take, let's say, a month of normal behavior that we can gather so we can actually define what the behavior looks like and then build a machine learning model that we can use to detect anomalous behavior. Well, we've also determined we don't think that's enough because we want to actually use the concepts that were created from active cyber defense and use the manipulation aspect of this in order to go on the offensive. And we can do that by creating trap slurs and decoys in order to be able to create this concept of AI-driven cyber deception. I also teach this class at University of Arizona. So what we're doing is we're taking cyber deception to the next level. So if you're not familiar with cyber deception, let me kind of help define that a little bit. So cyber deception has actually been around for a long time. People have thought about this for many, many years. The concept of cyber deception is an effective and complementary defense to overcome asymmetric challenges that we face by traditional detection and prevention strategies. So in other words, we kind of want to augment, right, traditional cybersecurity technologies with more information that's situational, that's happening now that we can actually perform. So how do we actually do that? Well, we want to basically do this for a couple of reasons. One, we want to provide specific premeditated actions that are designed to mislead, confuse the attackers that result hopefully in mistakes or missteps that aid traditional cybersecurity mechanisms. So think about it. If we have a way to be able to detect behaviors because we've inserted technology into the environment, remember stage one, we understand our environment really well and how it behaves. So the question is, can we then insert deceptive methods within that environment that will allow us to detect behavior early in the kill chain cycle, not later in the kill chain cycle when we actually get to that point. And the purpose of this is to be able to confuse the attackers, to cause them to waste their time, and also hopefully give up information about them. Some history about cyber deception, like I said, it's been around a long time. In 1994, Tripwire came out that allowed us to identify files that were touched. Back in 1998, we built one of these for Windows that was more dynamic. And certainly Fred Cohen and his deception toolkit were there. These all happened in the late 90s, early 2000s to basically create instrumentation with cyber deception technologies that we could employ. So what are some of the names of these? You've probably heard the word honeypot, but maybe you haven't heard honey tokens or honey words. So the concept behind honeypots are creating networks and environments that are dynamic and changing that cause the attacker to waste time and go to areas that are not of interest. But more interesting than that are things like honey tokens and honey words. So the concept is that behind honey tokens, for example, is the concept of creating decoy files within the environment, or decoy protocols that are really not, or decoy services that are running on certain machines that are not actually doing anything. And if anything touches those services, touches those files, touches that data, we know that it's something that is aberrant within the environment we're trying to protect. Honey words are really interesting and can be applied in ICS environments as well. What if we give out or leak information about certain usernames or passwords or email addresses, and we put those out there? And if that comes out, and we know the darknet, whatever, are looking for those things, and if we see that usage of those usernames or those passwords to actually enter our systems, now we have an advantage. So we know that the individual that is using these, or using the honey tokens, is somebody that's attacking those things. Now we have a choice, right? Do we just block them, or do we send them into another area of the system? And this is where AI comes in. So the more we know about the attacker and their abilities and what they're doing, we can actually push them in other areas. We do that for two reasons. One, we want them to waste resources and spin their wheels and not get any real results. But we also want to understand their capability and what they're after. And so by doing that, now we potentially can do something that the Pearl talked about, which was attribution. So how can we attribute what's happening to an individual or a cell or an organization? And once we can do that, we can either prosecute or, depending on how bad they are, use kinetics in order to eliminate the threat. But understand the advantage of this is our ability to deceive the attackers. Now, here's something that's not popular that I talk about, because remember, those attackers could be insiders. You know, we all trust all of the people that work in our environments, and they're all perfect and they don't have any problems and whatever. But it's not true. They've been vetted, and the FBI's done their background check, and they're psychologically sound and all that kind of stuff. But we can also then identify bad behavior by individuals in the organizations. Some of those bad behaviors may just be mistakes. They may not be malicious. So it becomes a training element, a learning event that we can go talk about, hey, we saw you doing this, and this is not something that we can do. This is outside of policy. This is not something you should be doing. So it allows us to do that as well. When we find people within our organization probing these systems or doing this, we can actually identify that behavior. So what are the goals of deception then, from that perspective? We want to be able to provide early indications and warning of unauthorized activity, as early in the kill chain as we can possibly do, whether it's during recon would be the best. We want to confuse and mislead the attackers within this environment, right, so that we can cause them to spin their wheels. We want to cause the attackers to waste or even exhaust resources that they may have so that we can perform that. And finally, we want to obtain attribution information regarding the attackers. This can include who they are, how sophisticated they might be, what are their objectives, and even provide insight into new defensive postures to employ. So remember, the whole world of hacking, as many of you in the room might know, changes daily. So if we can glean more information about new techniques early in the cycle, then we can actually change the security posture as we move forward in order to defend against those. So instead of basically doing it after there's been an IOC, an indication of compromise occurred, and we've lost and we've breached systems, and we've had to basically restore systems because of ransomware, we can now basically start to take proactive action in order to be able to define defensive postures that we can deploy. Now, these defensive postures that we want to deploy need to be active. In other words, it's not about putting another firewall, intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system, zero trust or whether in an environment. It's about coming up with new ideas on how to defend or engage the attackers. And we can't do this if we don't have both of the things that I talked about today. One, we have to have definitive understanding of the environment we're trying to protect. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. It's not just enough to know what boxes are on the network and what they're supposed to do. We want to understand what their actual real behavior is over a period of time, so that we really understand what's happening within our environment. So that's step one. Because we can't do step two and detect, use machine learning and AI in order to be able to detect the aberrant behavior unless we understand that at that deep level. And we certainly cannot employ cyber deception methods if we don't understand our environment and how we could actually, it allows us to give us insight and say, oh, here we could actually, this would be a great place where we could add deception. So if this occurs within our environment, we want an early indication that this is happening so that we can take action. But we can't do that if we don't understand the environment that we're operating in completely. So those are some of the things that we're doing in our research that we're after. So how does cyber deception apply to ICS in critical environments? It provides these early indications and warning of nefarious activities, reconnaissance activities, along with unusual insider behaviors, as I mentioned. It creates a detailed behavioral baseline of normal activity. This is the essential first step that I just mentioned before the deployment of cyber deception methods. AI-driven cyber deception is a new area that we're working on at UA, and we're learning that this can assist in both avoiding the discovery of deployed cyber deception methods. Because again, one of the problems is that the hacking community has developed techniques that can detect when they're being deceived, right? And know that they're in the middle of a honey net or honeypot, or they're basically looking at honey words or honey tokens, and they know we're doing that. So we have to basically do that in a way, using AI, to change that environment in order to be able to react to what they're doing. And this allows us to not only protect those deception methods that we're putting in place, but it also provides the ability to confuse attackers that can cause them to waste the resource and move on to another target. Finally, determining the objectives of the attackers early in the kill chain allows us to adjust the postures to defend against those attacks and improve other technologies that will detect and prevent those attacks in the future. A couple points that I want to make before I close and open it up for questions. If anybody in the room is interested in some of the technology that we've already created, send a message to Mike@silentsignals.com. Those technologies that we're building are open source. So we will provide them. Just reach out to Mike directly. We don't just post them on GitHub and let people download them, right? So if there are people in the community that we're trying to support, we'll provide that technology. We'd like two things. One, we'd like you to experiment with those and give us your feedback. But also, if you have ideas and want to add to what we're already building here on the research side, we'd love to hear from you there and actually integrate those new ideas that you might have either into the first phase of what I talked about, which was the ability to baseline an environment in a very unique way, and then build detectors of machine learning that will detect those, and secondly, those cyber deception methods that we want to basically continue to evolve. So those are the things that we're doing. So contact Mike, and he will get you information on how we basically can supply you with those technologies that we're working on, and they're all work in progress. So with that, I know I covered a lot in 30-some minutes, but did anybody have any questions or anything you want me to clarify in that? Yes, sir.
So in the beginning, we were talking about finding millions of lines or millions of incidents.
Yeah.
So why not, and you did discuss Wireshark, so why not just use filtering in Wireshark to reduce the set before doing AI ML as an augment, or possibly just using the Wireshark filtering capabilities as a whole for
Yeah, everything here is written in Python. I should have mentioned that. The reason is that I love Wireshark, and I've known her for many years, and I love Wireshark, and I have no problem with that. It's just that programmatically we weren't able to make it happen. There were so many things that we were doing in the identification and the filtering of those packets because it's more complicated than just filtering. So, for example, we're also tallying the number of packets that occur at a certain time frame. We're basically doing lookups of countries and MAC addresses and all of those things within modeling so that we can basically attribute those to a manufacturer, attribute those to a country, attribute those to a protocol, identify protocols that we think are malicious so we can identify those alerts. Those are more difficult, we found, to do those in Wireshark than it is to do them within Python and within the code that we're writing. That's what we have found. And then also the transition of that data, right, from our tools into machine learning are automatic because they're both written in Python, right? So basically taking the data sets that we're creating in Python through the analysis of those, they map directly into machine learning algorithms that we can plug those into. At least that's our approach. I'm not suggesting that the Wireshark approach is not a good one. It's just different than the path that we've taken. Any other questions? Yes?
So do you have the ability to ingest the CCAP in your tool, or do you have to actually live the data?
Two things. We have sensors that will create this from live data, or we can replay PCAPs. So we can do it either way based on the tools that we've built. I showed it here doing a PCAP so I could do the replay, but we have Raspberry Pi and Nooks and ELINT devices that we can implant right on the network that will capture and create what we have to do in order to be able to build those data sets. So both. Yes?
Could you describe, for someone's done the rest of this in the ICS ecosystem, what is particularly difficult about doing behavior analytics between these devices versus doing ICS Hosmer?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that what we're finding is that analyzing this in a ICS environment requires us to dive deeply into the ICS protocols, whether it's Modbus or BACnet, whatever you're using, in order to be able to model those behaviors. And although Wireshark can capture those, to be able to match up those requests and responses and be able to identify anomalies within those request responses, whether it was BACnet or Modbus or any of the other protocols, is more difficult. So that's the code that we've written in order to be able to match those up. So we're not looking at this only at flow, but we're also looking at actual packets that are associated with both requests and responses in these environments and modeling those. So that's the distinction that we're applying within the work that we're doing to basically model that behavior. So it's not just modeling the behavior of flow, it's modifying the actual details of the request responses in those environments that we would expect within that environment. And we have mapped all of those request response possibilities from, let's say, Modbus or BACnet into our models, so we know how to actually connect the dots for those, number one, but also what they are and what they mean, right, in order to be able to do that. So that semantic understanding of what's happening within those environments we think is important. Because a lot of people have tried to do this at the IP layer and basically just mapping flow to be able to detect behavior problems. And most of those have not been that effective. We found that we've got to go deeper into the protocol to understand what's happening and better understand the modeling of the timing. The last point that I'll make, because it's a really good question, is that what we're finding is that even with all of that, if we're not also adding into our equation the environmental information that we have that happens at the same time that we're modeling the environment, we don't have enough information yet. So let me give you an example. So let's say, for instance, let's take a hypothetical situation where we have an environment that is controlling temperature within, let's say, a set of buildings, okay? So it's an ICS environment that's basically got chillers and whatever that are basically performing this operation. Well, we can model that all day long, But if we don't model what the actual conditions outside of that environment are, we don't have enough information. So in other words, if the modeling of that data, the temperature, humidity, and other things that are happening in the environment don't match what's occurring, you know, in the baseline that we've created, now we have an anomaly. So in other words, why are we doing so much chilling when it's only 81 degrees outside, when the model says that this behavior is analogous to when it's 95 degrees outside? So now we're basically able to add in those factors, very simple example, but those environmental factors, and it could be weather, it could be vibration, it could be human interaction within the environment that we want to be able to model. We are not there yet. We understand, though, that it's going to be important to model that human factors and those other environmental characteristics along with the data that's in the packets. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I have one follow-on.
Sure.
Because it seems like from your description, the normal behavior is mapped almost like in a roadway, like understanding existing protocols. From there, how do you, like, is there a asymmetry in the amount of data that you have to model like the bad behavior then? Or like where are you getting the bad behavior?
Yeah, so the question is that typically when you're building supervised machine learning, I have examples of good behavior and bad behavior.
Right.
So we have to synthetically create the bad behavior, okay, in order to be able to identify that and identify that. Also, we're doing some of this other stuff that is talked about from the environmental side that would allow us to detect anomalies in the behavior. Or when is it occurring, right? You know, what is the modeling of that information at the time of day of week? Was it a holiday? You know, was there maintenance and other factors that went into this that caused that anomaly to be detected? And is it real? Can we then basically generate a legitimate alarm, you know, based on that? So great questions. That's exactly the problem we're dealing with, to have enough information to identify good versus bad. So if we don't use supervised learning, right, if we use linear regression or other techniques, we can then define statistics that are out of range. And so we use those as well. So, great questions. Yes?
For the cyber deception,
Yes.
if you have a system that is built on a memory model, what's the best layer to start with that deception tool set? On the business layer and the example process?
Yeah, we're looking at it from the ICS point of view, not from the business side. So we're looking at it as the behaviors that we want to be able to insert. I'll give you an example. We want to insert services on certain endpoints that are really not involved in, that are fake, right? And we want to be able to move those around so they're not only on one machine. So they end up getting attacked, and that gives us this early indication that why is anybody even touching the service that actually has no, it may appear to have value within the environment that we're having, but it really doesn't, right? It's a fake service that's basically running that somebody's going to touch. So those are the kinds of insertions of deception that we're doing within ICS environments. Then you can put them anywhere on any system. Obviously, if it's RTOS or something, maybe a little more difficult, but most of those are becoming more standard Linux operating systems or whatever, where we can actually insert those services easily. Yes, sir.
For the insertion of, if I just call it honey access in general, do you expect that to be a static process that would happen well beforehand, or is your system something that's designed to dynamically produce behaviors text to decide whether that looks passive?
The research is to make it dynamic and driven by AI. And we've done that in several other environments, so we have something to rely on to basically create those behaviors and change those based on things that, like the environment, that are out there that simulate this kind of change. For example, new user accounts are getting created. Why are they getting created? Those kinds of things that we can actually vary that baseline in order to be able to do that. And we can do that on a daily basis if necessary, right? So, simple example, but that's the kind of thing that we can actually automate and change. Typically in ICS environments, all the IP addresses are static, right? They're not dynamically allocated. So we can't do anything there, but we can actually insert other protocols in the mix that people might want to think that they could steal information out that has data in it that will lead them into another area. right? To kind of give you an idea of the kind of stuff that we're playing around with.
So pre-detection of those assets might be very sparse.
Right, right. And then the second stage of that, which is really fun, if we find somebody that's doing something bad or nefarious or whatever, can we engage them? You know, in a way that would allow us to gain more information about what they're doing, who they are, where they're coming from, how sophisticated are they, and then be able to, you know, attribute that to whoever the attacker might be, right? So that's the secondary piece. Or we can just shut them down. But if we shut them down, then they know, and there's some advantage to that because then maybe they'll go away. Right? You know, it's too hard to get into the system or to go catch somebody else that doesn't have this involved, right? It's the old, you know, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you, right? And so, you know, from that perspective, there's a couple different thoughts that you might take. And it may depend upon what you detect as the sophistication of that particular attacker, right? And what stage you're in. Are we in recon? Okay, I'm not too worried if I'm in recon, right? If he goes to the next level, then, hey, now we need to start to think about how we want to react. Right? So those are some of the fun things that we're working on. I'm working on with Mike, and I'm working on it at UA. Well, anybody else? Yes.
How do you ensure that the detection techniques don't get flagged as false positives?
Say one more time. I just didn't quite hear you.
So you're saying detection techniques. How do you ensure that they're not picked up by the model that you're trying to create false positives?
Yeah, so it's a challenge, right? A lot of the more sophisticated attacks and attackers are trying to identify those environments that they're operating in that may be instrumented that way. So those changes have to dynamically change in order to be able to avoid detection. And that's part of one of the tricks that we're using AI for, is how do we actually modify these in a way that are not going to give away that their detection, that they appear to be normal, right, to an attacker that's coming after those environments. Yeah, we don't have it solved, but that's the goal. Yes, sir?
Do you see the behaviors individually that are not as vicious? Whether we have changed in the past?
One more time.
Do you see behaviors in your product? Individually they are not very vicious, but when they are changed across the past,
Yeah, so there's a sequence that we're modeling as well, you know, from that perspective, in order to be able to detect the sequence of events, because they can be low and slow, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be fast. So we have to basically mark those anomalies that we're seeing and then basically identify those as we go forward. One of the things that, I don't want to go over my time, one of the things I want to mention is that when we've instrumented systems with this technology already, one of the dangers is when we do the baselining operations, we're finding environments that have already been compromised, right? That they don't know have been compromised. So when you're actually doing that, it's kind of an interesting problem that you run into. I'll give you one story. It's a really simple one, but we were modeling a network of a power plant. And when we were doing the modeling of the power plant for do the baseline operations, we're finding connections to Russia, you know, from the internal organization. Within the systems that were in ICS. We brought this up to the folks that were there, and they said, oh yeah, we know what that is. I said, yeah, I know what it is too, but I wanted to make sure you knew what it was. So they were getting their virus updates from Russia. We all know the company that provides that service, right? And I said, do you think this is a good idea? You know, I'm not saying that all the Russians are bad, but you know, and that organization has some validity, but you shouldn't be getting it from the mainland Russia. If you want to basically use their technology, bring it in-house and make sure that you've got it controlled. So those are the kinds of things that people just make simple mistakes because they've integrated a technology that they haven't actually analyzed its behavior well enough to know that it causes a risk. So we find those things, you know, when we're baselining environments, you know, as well. Obviously services that shouldn't be running and all of the common things. But the funny part is the ability for us to be able to, the question that you had earlier, what are we detecting? You know, this and what you said about, you know, Wireshark, is that we want to be able to identify where every single IP connection is in the world, right? That is really easy to do in our environment because we've mapped it all. We have large databases of where all those IP addresses are, so we can actually map them to a country or even a city, right? more difficult to do in Wireshark by using just filtering. So we have to actually program stuff. We actually have to write code, build databases, and all that kind of stuff in order to make that happen, right? We have the entire OUI database, so we know every manufacturer of every MAC address that's out there and ones that don't exist, because that would be, if it's a pineapple or something we know as well. But what if it doesn't exist in the OUI? Why? Where did that come from then? Who created that MAC address? Did somebody spoof a MAC address because they were trying to do something else that doesn't exist in the OUI? Right, so it's important to have that information that we can do the lookups and add those to the baseline so we know exactly what those devices are, or at least who manufactured them, right? So those are some of the things that we've worked hard on to get those databases in place. The same thing with protocols. We have tens of thousands of protocols that we've modeled. So we know if I get a protocol at this particular port, I can tell you what it possibly is. Not only the first 1,024, but up to 55, 56,000 before we get into the ephemeral range. So we can actually model those if they've been used maliciously. Those are really important to be able to identify. Wireshark does that though. Wireshark does actually provide some of that information. But we have that mapped out to, I think, 55,000 in the range of port numbers. So those things are really important to be able to identify and bring to light, even in the baselining process. And even more so, if it wasn't in the baselining process, then if it's we're seeing that anomaly, it's another anomaly we can identify easily. That doesn't require AI, right? We can just basically have a rule that says, hey, if we're seeing any of these, then we want to basically generate an alarm. But to your point, which I think is a really good one, if that's sequenced with something else, then it could basically appear to be a broader attack. So really good question. Anything else? I don't want to go over my time. Was this helpful? Was this useful? Remember, if you want any of this stuff, contact Mike. He controls all of this. I just write the code and do some of the research, most of the research, and but Mike would be happy to work with you if you have some ideas and want to play around with this stuff. Okay? Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you for joining us for another ICS Village production. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Find us on icsvillage.com to become involved with our community.